Before we begin, if you're interested in serious, research-driven explorations of biblical history that go beyond familiar narratives, this is the kind of story worth following closely. Long before modern debates about angels, demons, or the origins of evil, there existed a text that attempted to explain all of it at once. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but as history, sacred history, as ancient readers understood it. The Book of Enoch opens in a world already fractured. It does not begin with creation, nor with Adam, nor with the flood. It begins with knowledge. Knowledge revealed, knowledge stolen, and knowledge that could not be taken back once released. This alone sets it apart from the canonical texts that later framed biblical theology. Enoch himself is a marginal figure in the Hebrew Bible. He appears briefly in Genesis, described only as a man who walked with God and was taken. No explanation, no narrative arc, no doctrine built around him. Yet in Second Temple Judaism, that silence became an opening rather than a conclusion. The Book of Enoch claims to fill that silence. Written and compiled over several centuries, it is not a single book in the modern sense, but a collection of related traditions. These texts reflect a period when Jewish theology was not fixed, but actively evolving, responding to empire, exile, and unanswered questions that the Torah alone did not resolve. Why does evil persist after the flood? Why does humanity repeatedly fail despite divine law? Why does the world appear ordered, yet broken? Enoch does not answer these questions gently. It introduces angels not as distant messengers, but as beings with agency, hierarchy, and moral responsibility. It describes a universe governed by laws as rigid as any earthly system, where rebellion has measurable consequences. This was not mythology to its earliest readers. Fragments of Enoch found among the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate that these texts were copied, preserved, and studied by communities deeply invested in scriptural purity. The language of Enoch influenced prayers, cosmology, and interpretations of Genesis circulating in Judea centuries before Christianity emerged. What is striking is not that Enoch was later excluded. What is striking is how central it once was. The book assumes that its audience already understands concepts never fully explained in the canonical Bible: the origin of corrupted spirits, the reason for catastrophic judgment, and the structure of the heavens themselves. In this sense, Enoch does not contradict Scripture. It operates beneath it, supplying a framework the biblical authors never explicitly spelled out. This raises an uncomfortable question for modern readers. If Enoch shaped how ancient believers understood Genesis, angels, and judgment, then removing it did not erase those ideas. It merely removed their explanation. And that omission was not accidental. By the end of the Second Temple period, theological authority had become a matter of survival. Texts that invited uncontrolled speculation about angels, cosmic rebellion, and divine secrecy became liabilities. What Enoch offered was depth, and depth can be dangerous when doctrine demands clarity. This is where the story truly begins. For centuries, scholars assumed the Book of Enoch survived only as a literary echo, referenced, debated, but no longer physically present in the ancient world. That assumption collapsed in the mid-20th century, when a series of discoveries in the Judean desert forced historians to rethink nearly everything they believed about early Jewish scripture. In the caves near Qumran, among scrolls containing Isaiah, Deuteronomy, and Psalms, fragments of Enoch appeared again and again, not as a curiosity, not as a lone experiment, but as one of the most frequently copied non-canonical texts in the entire collection. This detail matters more than it seems. The Dead Sea Scrolls reflect the reading habits of a community obsessed with purity, authority, and correct interpretation of Scripture. Texts were not copied casually. Each scroll required labor, resources, and justification. The presence of Enoch in multiple copies suggests something unavoidable. For these Jews, Enoch was not marginal, it was foundational. Even more striking is the language of these fragments. They were written in Aramaic, the spoken language of the people, not Hebrew reserved only for formal liturgy. This indicates that Enoch was meant to be understood, discussed, and taught, not hidden behind priestly barriers. It circulated among readers who saw it as explanatory, not speculative. Enoch helped answer questions the Torah left open. Genesis speaks briefly of sons of God and daughters of men, but offers no commentary. Enoch expands this into a detailed narrative, naming the angels involved, describing their descent, and outlining the consequences of their actions. This was not seen as contradiction, but clarification, an interpretive tradition running parallel to Scripture. Modern readers often assume that ancient Judaism operated with a closed canon similar to later Christianity. The evidence shows the opposite. During the Second Temple period, authority was fluid. Texts gained influence through usage, not official decrees. A book mattered if communities trusted it to explain the world as they experienced it. And Enoch explained too much. It described the heavens as layered and ordered. It portrayed angels as administrators of natural law. It connected moral failure on earth to cosmic rebellion beyond it. This framework resonated deeply in a world shaped by foreign empires and unexplained suffering. It also explains why Enoch became indispensable to apocalyptic thought. Later works, including portions of Daniel, Jubilees, and even early Christian writings, echo its language and assumptions. The influence is subtle but measurable. Terms for judgment, descriptions of fiery punishment, and the expectation of a final reckoning appear in Enoch long before they become central in later theology. These ideas did not emerge suddenly in Christianity. They were inherited. Yet despite its popularity, Enoch never achieved formal canonical status in Judaism. The reasons were not purely theological, they were also practical. A text that names angels, maps the heavens, and assigns blame for evil outside human choice complicates moral accountability. It shifts part of history's burden away from humanity and toward the unseen. As Jewish leadership rebuilt identity after the destruction of the Second Temple, stability mattered more than speculation. Scripture needed to be controlled, finite, and interpretable without cosmic intermediaries. Enoch resisted that control. Its worldview assumed a universe crowded with beings, laws, and secrets that human institutions could not regulate. It encouraged readers to think beyond visible power structures, political, priestly, or imperial. That kind of thinking had consequences, and those consequences would shape which books survived, and which were slowly pushed to the margins of history. At the center of the Book of Enoch is a vision of the universe that feels unfamiliar to modern theology, yet perfectly coherent to the ancient world that produced it. Heaven is not abstract. It is structured, layered, and governed by delegated authority. Angels are not decorative symbols. They are administrators. Enoch describes named angels assigned to specific domains: winds, stars, seasons, boundaries, and judgment. This reflects a broader ancient Near Eastern worldview in which divine order was maintained through intermediaries. What makes Enoch distinctive is not the concept itself, but the precision with which it is articulated. Nothing in this system is random. The movements of celestial bodies follow appointed laws. The cycles of nature are supervised. Even chaos has limits enforced by heavenly beings. This explains why Enoch's angelology felt compelling to Second Temple readers. It offered order in a world dominated by political instability and foreign rule. Unlike later simplified angel theology, Enoch presents hierarchy. Some angels teach, some govern, some observe, some judge. Their authority is derivative, not independent. They act within a structure ultimately accountable to God. This distinction mattered. It preserved monotheism while allowing for a complex spiritual ecosystem that mirrored earthly administrations under empire. Modern readers often struggle with this because later traditions flattened these ideas. Angels became messengers. Demons became abstractions. The cosmos became distant. Enoch preserves an earlier stage, where divine governance was imagined in familiar administrative terms. The most controversial element of this system is not the existence of angels. It is their fallibility. Enoch does not portray all angels as obedient by nature. Some are capable of transgression. They can violate boundaries, misuse knowledge, and disrupt the balance they were assigned to maintain. This introduces a theological tension absent from later canonical texts. If angels can rebel, then evil is not limited to human failure. This idea reframes the problem of suffering. It suggests that corruption entered the world through layered responsibility: human, angelic, and cosmic. For ancient readers, this was not an excuse. It was an explanation. The Watcher's narrative, which will be explored in detail later, emerges directly from this worldview. But even before that episode, Enoch establishes a universe where divine order is actively managed and occasionally threatened by beings other than humanity. This has implications for how early Jews read Genesis. Passages that appear cryptic or incomplete gain clarity within Enoch's framework. The flood becomes not only a judgment on humanity, but a response to cosmic disorder. Violence on earth mirrors rebellion in heaven. History is not isolated. It is connected. Such ideas were not fringe speculation. They were embedded in how time, law, and morality were understood. Even the calendar systems found at Qumran reflect Enochic influence, organizing time according to heavenly order rather than human convenience. This level of cosmic detail made Enoch powerful. It also made it dangerous. A text that maps divine authority so explicitly risks competing with institutional interpretation. It leaves little room for ambiguity, and ambiguity is often where religious authority operates most comfortably. As theological leadership moved toward consolidation, Enoch's structured universe became a liability. It offered answers that bypassed priestly mediation. It encouraged readers to imagine divine governance beyond visible hierarchies. In time, that imagination would be restrained. But the imprint of Enoch's angelic cosmos never fully disappeared. It survived in fragments, echoes, and assumptions that would later re-emerge, often without acknowledgement of their source. The universe had already been mapped. The canon simply chose not to include the map. At the center of the Book of Enoch lies the narrative that caused the greatest controversy across centuries, the account of the Watchers. This is not presented as allegory or later myth. For Second Temple Jewish readers, it was a serious theological explanation for why the world became irreversibly corrupted. In Enoch, the Watchers are a specific group of angels assigned to observe humanity. Their role was limited. Their authority was delegated. They were meant to witness human development, not intervene in it. The transgression begins not with violence, but with boundary crossing. The Watchers descend to the earth. They take human women as wives. They transmit knowledge that humanity was never meant to possess. Enoch is precise about this forbidden knowledge. It includes metallurgy and weapon-making, the use of cosmetics and enchantments, astrology, the reading of signs, and the techniques of warfare. This list is deliberate. Each item corresponds to technologies that, in the ancient world, were associated with accelerated violence, social breakdown, and moral collapse. Evil, in Enoch's framework, does not arise spontaneously. It is taught. This is a fundamental departure from later theological models that locate the origin of sin entirely within human choice. In the Enochic worldview, humanity does not simply fall. It is instructed, armed, and destabilized by forces that violate their appointed limits. From this union emerge the giants, often called the Nephilim. They are not portrayed as legendary monsters. They are the logical result of disrupted cosmic order. Their hunger is uncontrollable. Their violence is systemic. The earth itself suffers under their presence. Within this framework, the flood becomes intelligible. It is not merely punishment for moral failure. It is a corrective response to a cosmic malfunction that had spread beyond human control. The destruction addresses both earthly corruption and heavenly rebellion. The Watchers are bound and removed from the world, confined until a future judgment. Their offspring are destroyed physically, but the story does not end there. This is where Enoch introduces one of its most influential and later suppressed ideas. After the death of the giants, their spirits remain. These spirits are neither angel nor human. They become restless, corrupting forces that afflict humanity. This concept offers a structured explanation for the origin of evil spirits without redefining God as the direct source of chaos. For ancient readers, this model was coherent. It connected Genesis, lived experience, and observed violence into a single explanatory system. It answered questions Scripture left implicit. It accounted for persistent corruption even after the flood. And that clarity was precisely the problem. The Watcher's narrative reduced ambiguity. It limited interpretive flexibility. It explained evil without requiring constant institutional mediation. For emerging religious authorities, this was dangerous territory, because a worldview that explains too much leaves very little room for control. The giants of the Book of Enoch occupy a space that later traditions struggled to define, and in many cases chose to ignore. In Enoch, they are not symbolic figures or poetic exaggerations. They are historical actors within a theological system that seeks to explain why violence once reached a scale the world could not survive. These beings are described as vast in size and appetite, but their defining trait is not physical magnitude, it is excess. They consume beyond need, destroy without restraint, and turn against both animals and humans. Civilization collapses under their presence, not because humanity is weak, but because the balance of creation has been violated. This portrayal aligns closely with ancient Near Eastern concerns. In early Jewish thought, disorder was not merely moral, it was cosmic. When boundaries between heaven and earth were breached, the result was not confusion, but devastation. The giants embody that devastation. They are the visible consequence of invisible rebellion. What is often overlooked is how carefully Enoch integrates this narrative with Genesis. Genesis mentions the Nephilim briefly, without explanation or judgment. Enoch does not contradict that silence. It expands it. It treats the giants not as mythic anomalies, but as a historical problem that required divine intervention. Their destruction is not vengeance. It is containment. This distinction matters. Later theological systems preferred to locate the cause of evil entirely within human disobedience. That approach simplifies accountability and preserves moral clarity. Enoch complicates this by introducing layered responsibility. Humans are guilty. Angels are guilty. The system itself has been compromised. In Enoch, the giants are destroyed because the world cannot continue with them in it. Their deaths are not framed as redemption, but as necessity. The flood eliminates their bodies, but it does not restore equilibrium on its own. Something remains unresolved. Violence continues. Corruption returns. History does not reset. This unresolved tension is crucial to understanding why Enoch mattered. If the flood did not solve the problem of evil, then the problem is deeper than human behavior. Enoch suggests that the spiritual aftermath of the giants' existence lingers, a residue of rebellion that cannot be erased through physical destruction alone. Later traditions found this deeply uncomfortable. A theology that admits lingering cosmic damage challenges the idea of clean divine solutions. It suggests that history is shaped not only by divine will and human choice, but by long-term consequences of ancient transgressions that cannot be easily undone. This perspective does not diminish God's authority. It reframes time. Judgment becomes gradual. Restoration becomes future-oriented. Evil is not eliminated in a single act, but restrained, delayed, and ultimately reserved for final resolution. The giants, then, are not the center of the story. They are evidence. Evidence that the world once crossed a threshold it could not uncross. Evidence that Scripture assumes a depth of history it does not always explain. Evidence that Enoch was not trying to replace Genesis. It was trying to finish the sentence Genesis left open. And that unfinished sentence would echo through later apocalyptic thought, long after the giants themselves were gone. The Book of Enoch does not end its explanation of history with the flood or the destruction of the giants. Instead, it turns its focus forward, toward judgment, restoration, and the fate of both human and non-human agents within the cosmic order. This is where Enoch becomes unmistakably apocalyptic, and where its influence on later literature becomes impossible to deny. Enoch describes judgment not as a single moment, but as a structured process. There are appointed times, designated places, specific beings assigned to carry out each phase. This concept of staged judgment reflects an ancient legal worldview. Justice unfolds through procedure, not impulse. The universe itself is portrayed as a courtroom governed by law rather than raw power. For early readers, this reinforced the idea that history was not chaotic, even when it appeared unjust. One of Enoch's most significant contributions is its portrayal of a final reckoning that involves angels as well as humans. The Watchers are not forgotten. Their punishment is delayed, not canceled. They are bound until an appointed time when all accounts are settled openly. This idea reshapes how judgment is understood. Evil is not merely punished because it exists. It is judged because it violated order. The language Enoch uses emphasizes balance, measurement, and restoration. Concepts later echoed in Jewish apocalyptic texts and eventually in Christian writings. Many themes commonly associated with the Book of Revelation appear here centuries earlier. A final judgment, the binding of corrupt spiritual powers, the vindication of the righteous, a transformed world order. These are not identical narratives, but they share a common grammar. Scholars have long noted that Enoch provided a vocabulary for discussing the end of history before the end of history became a formal theological category. Importantly, Enoch's vision of judgment is not driven by fear. It is driven by accountability. The righteous are not rewarded arbitrarily. They are vindicated because the moral structure of the universe demands resolution. Likewise, punishment is not framed as cruelty, but as correction of imbalance introduced long ago. This is why Enoch resonated so strongly in periods of oppression. For communities living under foreign rule, the promise of a measured cosmic justice offered stability. History might be unjust in appearance, but it was not abandoned. The universe was still governed. Later religious authorities would grow cautious of this message. Apocalyptic expectation can inspire hope, but it can also undermine present authority. A text that emphasizes future divine judgment risks diminishing the finality of institutional power in the present. Enoch places ultimate resolution outside human systems. That was its strength. It was also its liability. As theological traditions matured, emphasis shifted toward ethical behavior within established structures rather than cosmic anticipation beyond them. Enoch's detailed eschatology became less useful and more disruptive, yet its imprint remained. When later texts spoke of final judgment, angelic restraint, and a restored order, they were drawing from a framework Enoch had already constructed. The architecture of apocalyptic thought was in place long before it entered the canon. The book may have been excluded, but its vision of how history ends quietly became foundational. Despite its later exclusion, the Book of Enoch was not treated as marginal by the earliest Christian communities. On the contrary, it was read, quoted, and assumed as authoritative by writers who stood at the very foundation of Christian theology. This is not speculation. Early Christian texts reference Enoch directly, not defensively or symbolically, but as a known source. The Epistle of Jude preserves a clear quotation attributed explicitly to Enoch, presenting his words as a prophetic warning. There is no apology, no clarification, no indication that the audience would question its legitimacy. That detail is critical. It tells us that for at least some early Christians, Enoch occupied a space adjacent to Scripture, perhaps not formally canonized, but intellectually trusted. Its worldview aligned naturally with early Christian concerns about judgment, spiritual conflict, and unseen powers influencing human history. The language fits seamlessly. Ideas of fallen angels, restrained spiritual forces, and a future reckoning were already part of the interpretive landscape. Christianity did not invent these concepts. It inherited them. Enoch provided a conceptual bridge between Hebrew scripture and emerging Christian theology. Church fathers such as Tertullian defended Enoch openly. He argued that the book had been rejected by some Jewish authorities, not because it was false, but because it spoke too clearly about Christ before his time. While later scholarship does not support that claim fully, it reveals how highly Enoch was regarded by early believers. What changed was not the text, it was the institution. As Christianity moved from persecuted movement to organized religion, theological boundaries hardened. Canon formation became an exercise in control as much as preservation. Texts needed to serve unity, clarity, and orthodoxy across vast and diverse communities. Enoch complicated that mission. Its angelology was too detailed, its cosmology too expansive, its explanation of evil too distributed. By attributing corruption partly to celestial rebellion, Enoch reduced the emphasis on inherited human guilt. By describing spirits operating outside ecclesiastical oversight, it challenged the Church's role as sole mediator of spiritual order. This made Enoch increasingly inconvenient. Gradually, references to it diminished. It was not formally condemned in the early centuries. It was simply sidelined, copied less, quoted less, taught less. Over time, silence accomplished what controversy could not. By the time biblical canon solidified, Enoch no longer fit the theological architecture being constructed. The irony is unavoidable. Christian theology retained many of Enoch's assumptions: judgment, angels, demons, cosmic conflict, while discarding the text that explained their origin. The structure remained. The blueprint was removed. Enoch did not disappear because it was false. It disappeared because it was too complete. And completeness, in an age of institutional consolidation, is often more threatening than error. While Christianity gradually distanced itself from the Book of Enoch, Rabbinic Judaism followed a parallel but distinct path toward exclusion. The reasons were not identical, but they were closely related. At the center was a shared concern over authority, interpretation, and control of theological boundaries. After the destruction of the Second Temple, Jewish leadership faced an existential crisis. Without a central sanctuary, identity had to be rebuilt around text, law, and interpretation. This process required a stabilized canon and a carefully regulated method of reading it. Texts that invited expansive speculation posed a risk to that stability. Enoch was precisely that kind of text. Its detailed descriptions of angels, heavenly courts, and cosmic rebellion went far beyond the Torah's measured restraint. It encouraged readers to imagine a spiritual world operating alongside, and sometimes independently of, human obedience to the law. For rabbinic thinkers focused on halakhic clarity, this was problematic. The issue was not belief in angels. Rabbinic literature contains extensive angelology, but it is controlled, indirect, and often intentionally ambiguous. Angels appear as messengers or executors of divine will, not autonomous agents whose failures reshape history. Enoch crosses that boundary. It names angels. It assigns them domains. It holds them accountable. This degree of specificity limits interpretive flexibility. It leaves little room for debate, reinterpretation, or gradual doctrinal development. In a tradition that valued discussion and layered meaning, Enoch's precision felt restrictive rather than illuminating. There was also a deeper concern. By explaining evil through angelic rebellion and inherited spiritual corruption, Enoch risked diminishing the centrality of the law as the primary solution to human disorder. If corruption originates beyond human action, then obedience alone cannot fully address it. That implication undermines the foundational role of Torah-centered life. As a result, Enoch fades from rabbinic transmission. It is not attacked directly. It is not labeled heretical in formal terms. Instead, it is quietly excluded from authoritative discussion. Other interpretive traditions are preferred, ones that emphasize human responsibility, covenantal obedience, and moral choice without cosmic intermediaries. This silence was effective. Over generations, what is not taught becomes unknown. What is unknown becomes irrelevant. Enoch survived only at the margins, preserved in Ethiopian Christianity, referenced indirectly, or rediscovered through archaeology rather than tradition. The pattern is telling. Both Judaism and Christianity inherited Enoch's ideas. Both struggled with Enoch's implications. And both ultimately decided that the system it presented was too expansive to manage within developing institutional frameworks. What remained was a narrower worldview, not simpler, but more controllable. And that narrowing would shape how later generations understood angels, evil, and judgment, often without realizing that an older, more detailed explanation had once existed just beyond the edges of the canon. When the Book of Enoch was set aside, It was not replaced by another text that answered the same questions with equal clarity. Instead, a gap emerged, subtle at first, but increasingly visible over time. The biblical worldview did not collapse, but it became quieter where Enoch had been explicit. This silence reshaped theology. Without Enoch, the origin of evil became compressed into simpler categories. Human disobedience carried more weight. Angelic rebellion faded into the background. The complexity of layered responsibility, human, spiritual, cosmic, was reduced in favor of moral immediacy and institutional coherence. This shift was not accidental. Religious systems function best when responsibility is clearly located. A theology that distributes blame across invisible hierarchies complicates accountability and challenges authority. Enoch had offered a universe where causes extended beyond human reach and consequences unfolded across centuries. That perspective was unsettling. What was lost was not belief in angels or judgment. Those remained. What was lost was context. Enoch provided a narrative infrastructure that connected scattered biblical references into a coherent cosmology. Without it, later interpretations relied on isolated verses rather than an integrated system. The effects can still be seen. Discussions of demons lack origin stories. Judgment is emphasized without procedural detail. Spiritual conflict is acknowledged but rarely explained. This does not render later theology incorrect. It renders it incomplete. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes this. Comparative studies of Second Temple literature show that Enoch was not an outlier, but a representative voice within a broader interpretive tradition. Its removal did not reflect consensus about truth, but consensus about manageability. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed this reality. They demonstrated that early Jewish readers were comfortable with theological plurality. Multiple texts coexisted, informed one another, and contributed to a shared understanding of the world. Canonization narrowed that diversity by necessity, not by discovery of error. Enoch became collateral. Its absence shaped centuries of interpretation, often without acknowledgement. Ideas drawn from it persisted, stripped of attribution, reframed as implicit rather than explicit. The result was a theology that assumed certain realities without explaining their origin. In this sense, Enoch did not vanish. It dissolved. Its concepts spread into the tradition, while the text itself faded from view. This makes modern debates about its authority somewhat misplaced. The question is not whether Enoch influenced biblical thought. The evidence shows that it did. The more difficult question is whether later readers can fully understand the biblical worldview without considering the texts that once defined its boundaries. Enoch suggests that the canon was not designed to explain everything. It assumed a world its original audience already knew. The Book of Enoch does not claim to replace Scripture, nor was it written to stand apart from it. Its function was explanatory. It addressed questions that the biblical text assumes rather than resolves, questions about the structure of the cosmos, the origin of corruption, and the reason judgment unfolds across history rather than in a single moment. Its removal from the canon was not the result of fraud or theological failure. It was the outcome of historical pressure. As religious traditions moved toward consolidation, clarity, and institutional stability, texts that expanded the universe too far beyond human control became difficult to sustain. Enoch expanded everything. It described a populated heaven governed by law. It framed evil as the consequence of layered rebellion. It presented judgment as procedural, delayed, and cosmic. These ideas were not rejected because they were false. They were set aside because they complicated governance, both theological and communal. A narrower canon offered consistency. Enoch offered depth. Yet depth has a way of enduring. Fragments survived. Quotations remained. Concepts embedded themselves into later theology under different names. Angels bound, spirits wandering, final judgment delayed. These ideas did not disappear. They simply lost their original framework. Modern archaeology and scholarship have restored that framework. The rediscovery of Enoch among the Dead Sea Scrolls did not elevate it to canonical status, but it forced historians to acknowledge its role. Enoch shaped how ancient Jews and early Christians understood Genesis, evil, and the unseen world. Ignoring it does not simplify biblical history. It distorts it. Understanding Enoch does not require belief. It requires context. The Bible, as it exists today, is a curated collection, not a complete archive of ancient belief. Enoch reminds us that the biblical world was once broader, more complex, and more openly speculative than later traditions allowed. The book was not removed because it explained too little. It was removed because it explained too much. And in doing so, it reveals something essential, not just about angels or judgment, but about how sacred history itself was shaped, narrowed, and preserved.